Testing. It's now 5:30 on Thursday, February 8th, 2024. So I'll go ahead and call to order this regular meeting of the Deschutes County Planning Commission. Our chair, Chair Williams, is not able to be here today, so I'm just going to be subbing in for her. And I will go ahead and just state who's present for the record. We've got Commissioner Cyrus, Commissioner Allman, Commissioner Kelly, Commissioner Hofkamp. And do we have anyone present on Zoom? Okay. And then, of course, me, Jessica Curis, I'm also present. Okay. First item on the agenda, approval of minutes from January 25th. Is there a motion about the minutes?
I will move to approve. I second.
Okay, so it's been moved and seconded to approve the minutes. Is there any discussion on the motion? Okay, so following Chair Williams' recent process, we're going to just say yay or nay. So all in favor say yay.
Aye.
Or aye. All opposed say nay. Okay, so it is unanimous that the minutes from January 25th, 2024 are approved. Next item on the agenda is public comment. So this is public comment about any item not on the agenda tonight. So we're deliberating about the comprehensive plan later, so we can't accept any more public comments about that. But would anyone like to make a comment about any other issue in the county regarding land use or concerns? Okay. Anyone on Zoom wanting to make a comment? No one on Zoom? All right, so moving forward, we'll go to our action items. Number one, deliberations, Deschutes County 2040 Comprehensive Plan Update. In a second, I'll turn it over to Nicole Mardell, our senior planner. But I just want to say that I am planning to follow the same format that Chair Williams set out for us last week so that we can have some consistency with our process here. And so we'll be kind of going through items on the matrix and or other things people want to raise and having a discussion about each item and then just taking a brief yay or nay, aye or nay audio vote before moving to the next item. Nicole?
Thank you, Chair Curis. Commissioners, for the record, Nicole Mardell, Senior Planner, Deschutes County Community Development. So you covered it well, Chair, kind of our process, but just some reminders for the group. So this is module 2 of your deliberations. At the last meeting, we discussed chapters 1 through 3. So community engagement, land use regional coordination, farm and forest lands. And now we're moving into our discussion about natural resources and natural hazards. At the next meeting, we'll be discussing recreation, housing, and economic development. And then the last meeting, we are discussing chapter 11, which relates to destination resorts. And we're also planning for that to cover miscellaneous items. So for instance, the commission wanted to discuss 2 specific letters from the record, COID's letter, Central Oregon Irrigation District, and Central Oregon Land Watch. So we'll plan to go through those letters at that meeting. I also wanted to note that I did get an email from Commissioner Cyrus with some redline edits and wanted to note just to make it clear to the group, the items included in the matrix are essentially a summary of some of the topics included in the public record, but they're not all exhaustive. These were just our attempt to kind of put them into buckets. So if there's anything that you want to discuss that isn't included here, please raise those, please bring those forward. But as you mentioned, our overall approach to deliberations is not necessarily to redline or wordsmith, but instead to really fix some of the items in the comprehensive plan that you just can't live without changing, since there's been so much planning commission review already have gone into it. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or happy to dive into our matrix.
Any questions for Nicole? Okay, let's go to item number 1 in that case. This question says, should policy language be added to require, underlined, any of the following measures? I won't read the whole thing out loud, but we can begin to discuss whenever everyone's ready. And if there is no discussion on any particular item, that's fine. We can just move on to the next item. We aren't obligated to discuss each item. It's more like if you have something you'd like to change about the plan the way it is, then please raise that issue so we can discuss it together. Would you guys like more time or should we move to the next item?
Maybe a minute.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Commissioner Altman?
I would be in favor of adding language, as is indicated in the right-hand column, that encourages state agencies to identify local areas of concern for water availability and explore additional regulations or requirements to ensure water capacity is not negatively impacted by development. I'm in favor of that language, whether in practicality anything would be done about it. I think it just recognizes that this was, from my recollection, a large concern for a lot of people is increased development and the impact to water availability. So I would support adding that language.
Other comments?
Susan, I'd support that as well.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Cyrus?
I don't have a problem with that type of recommendation, but I think it would also be important that if we're going to go that direction with regard to water capacity, that we also discuss all of the other things that affect water capacity, such as the plant species, for example, in number 521C, that such as junipers that are impacting the water recharge, and also, quite frankly, probably the single biggest impact on water right now in Central Oregon is the piping of the ditches and canals. So we're actually having a significant impact on our aquifers by interfering with the recharge. And I guess to Nicole's point, and since you want generalities rather than specifics, I'm fine with some language encouraging the state to address, at least take a look at this, but I think it needs to be a broader statement that they need to look at all of the impacts of the groundwater, not necessarily just withdrawals.
Okay, so it sounds like we've got a good, I'm sorry, I don't know how to do this without emotion. Like,
So I guess the question, are we doing motions on these things, or are we just submitting comments for Nicole to incorporate into the next version?
what works best for you? Is it easy? I liked how the minutes had the summary of the, like no motion made, no recommendation, like no, or a recommendation made, here's a motion. Ideally, I would say like, if it's something where there's not, where maybe a change is being recommended and there's not everyone agreeing, I would prefer to have a motion so that we can recommend that to the board, but just whatever works for you guys.
Yeah, I think you have a couple of options. So you could certainly have a motion table. And in that case, it would be, if commissioners felt strongly that, again, we're trying to avoid wordsmithing, but sometimes you can't avoid it. So let's say that the group wanted a specific vote so that the board had a number of, yes, this was a 6-0, or it was a 3-3, you can show kind of that representation of that discussion, or you could just give general feedback to staff and we could represent kind of both perspectives to the board and try to craft language that strikes a balance. But again, if you're seeking to move maybe in one direction that it's not, a middle ground, then we'd probably want some consensus from the group, or at least a vote.
Yeah. Okay. So, I'll, I'm trying to stick as much as possible with what Commissioner Williams decided to do with this. But I guess since I'm in charge at the moment, I'll just say it would probably be best if we could move this along with a motion of one or the other. And then we could just get the votes there and forward our recommendation on and get on with the next item.
So we do currently have a motion on the table.
No one's made a motion.
Then I guess the question is whether you want just a general. I mean, I would agree with the suggestion that it makes sense to support the decision point, but I would suggest that we expand it as I recommended, and maybe just a simple consensus on the commission on whether that's a direction we want to go, whether we need a motion.
Okay, well, I will say that I want the plan to stay the way it is. I think that the plan adequately addresses the different views of people on this in the county. I don't think that personally I wouldn't recommend a change. And so that's
Madam-
just a minority viewpoint. That's okay.
Madam Chair.
Yeah.
I guess I'll go ahead and make a motion. My recollection of Chair Williams' procedure is that she wasn't necessarily opposed to motions, but maybe some discussions and so forth. So I hope that that's okay with you and with her to go ahead and make a motion.
Yes, please.
So I'll move that we recommend this option A in a new policy. I want to respect my colleague Commissioner Cyrus's comment, but maybe we can address some of those with some subsequent policies. I don't think they need to be overly broad, and this is a sort of encouraging some collaboration. So I'll recommend policy, whatever number it ends up being there, that we, as is stated in the draft language, encourage state agencies to identify local areas of concern for water availability and explore additional regulations or requirements to ensure water capacity is not negatively impacted by development.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor say yes or aye.
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 All opposed say nay. Nay. Okay, let's move to the next item. Should additional policies be added to address coordination with state agencies on water related issues we got 3 bullet points here. Is anyone wanting anything to change about the plan with this item? Would anyone like some more time? Okay, seeing none, we'll move to number 3. Should policy language relating to tribal governments on water and wildlife related issues be amended?
I'll just observe if I can, Chair, that the existing policies, in my view, address this concern. So I don't see the need for more language.
Anyone else?
Concur.
I agree.
Okay, number 4, should additional references to the wild and scenic waterway status for the Deschutes River be added to the comprehensive plan? So while other people are thinking, I think it's a good idea, and I like what the staff have suggested here. If yes, the planning commission may recommend option A, a new policy revisit recommendations of the 1996 Upper Deschutes Wild and Scenic River and State Scenic Waterway Comprehensive Plan or its successor, and consider, one of my favorite words, implementation of voluntary recommendations into the county code. So if I'm understanding this correctly, it would just be there's some parts of this plan, that the wild and scenic plan, that are already being implemented because they have to be implemented, but there's some optional voluntary ones, and we're saying like maybe we should put in there that we should consider implementation of the voluntary recommendations.
That is exactly correct.
Yeah.
Chair. Yes. So I think the main way that this is implemented is through the county's landscape management combining zone. We also provide notice to Oregon Parks and Rec Department for applications impacting the state portion. But revisiting the recommendations could help us identify areas that we may not have already implemented into county code. That would be essentially a good idea.
Okay. Does anyone else have an opinion one way or the other on this one?
I second.
Okay. Commissioner Hopecamp, do you have an opinion?
Oh, no, thank you, no.
Okay, so, can we just do this as a motion, you guys? Okay, all in favor, say aye.
I
Aye. All opposed, say nay.
Say nay, thanks.
Okay. So we have, 1, 2, 3, 4 in favor and 1 opposed. Okay, number 5. Should policy language be amended to ensure county participation in the Deschutes Basin Water Collaborative? Anyone have feelings about this one?
Appears to already be covered.
Yeah, I agree with Commissioner Cyrus. You know,
Okay, that was my thought as well. Commissioner Altman, any feelings? Okay, cool. So no comment on number 5, no changes recommended. Number 6, should policy language should policy language related to dark skies lighting be strengthened?
this appears, if I may, Chair, to be just a one-word edit from what I can tell from the existing language. Is it more than that?
Just one word, you are correct.
Just one word, and I'm fine with reduce with the existing language. It reverses a little bit. Yeah, I'm fine with the existing language.
Other people? Okay, so it doesn't seem like we are asking for a change on number 6 either. I know we're all, well, I shouldn't speak for everyone. I'm quite a fan of dark skies, but I also am fine with the current language. Number 7, should the county add new policies to address climate and air quality issues from human activities?
I have a question. When I was kind of reading this, I was wondering why couldn't we have both? Why could we have continue using develop and implement climate action plan to address the potential future impacts of climate change on Deschutes County through initiatives or regulations? So is this kind of suggesting that we kind of choose, is using the term climate action plan kind of a hot, in eliminating that word, does that plan, does that kind of change the scope? Like how I'm kind of diving into thinking like that means something.
I think that's a great question, Commissioner. So essentially the topic at hand is we had some comments in the record about maybe going a bit further in the plan in relation to, addressing climate change. So I wanted to note that this was a significant topic of community interest during our outreach events. And quite a few folks agreed generally that there was a desire to address this topic, but there was kind of differing opinions on how to address it. So a climate action plan is kind of a best practice typically that cities undertake if they really want to dive into this topic. You typically hire a consultant, things like that. Whereas I think, some folks might want to just skip that and, go into directly, providing incentives or regulations to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change. So that's why we changed the language if you wanted to go a step further to kind of skip that climate action plan component. But the language could be hybrid. And essentially, this is essentially just something for you to respond to or react to. So if there were other, policy suggestions that commissioners wanted to offer to, you are certainly welcome to do so.
Madam Chair. Yeah, I actually like your proposed new language. I think it's a little softer. Instead of creating a climate action plan, you're addressing the potential impacts. I mean, I'm old enough to remember when we had an impending ice age, and 10 years later, we were all going to die because of acid rain, and then it was the ozone. And quite frankly, I'm I'm still a little bit of a skeptic on the current fear mongering, and I rather take a cautious approach and take a look at what we can do with regard to potential impacts. And even the studies that I have seen, that assuming the climate is warming and such, says Central Oregon will be a beneficiary rather than a victim of the thing. And in fact, it'll be good for our area and climate. So no, I certainly don't have an opposition to some language addressing it, but I think this language is more appropriate.
So you'd be in favor of the new suggested language?
Yes, in fact, I would move adoption of the proposed language.
Is there a second to that?
I'll second.
Okay. So let's keep discussing it. Since we're kind of mid-discussion, I really like the idea of having a climate action plan. I think I like plans. So if we have another planning process, that sounds great. But I also like the idea of just getting to it as well. So,
Yeah, Madam Chair.
Commissioner Cyrus?
I like the idea where it says is address the potential future impacts. So we're addressing what could happen. We're not going to make the assumption that it's absolutely going to happen, and which is I think the one puts us in a tighter box than the proposed language.
Okay. Other comment?
When I was reading this, I was liking, I also like the language climate action plan, but I also like adding through incentives and or regulations. So I liked both. That would be, if I was to make a motion, it would be to have both.
Okay.
I think I'm with Commissioner Kelly on this.
Yeah. Okay. So quickie vote on Commissioner Cyrus's motion. All in favor say yes.
Aye.
All opposed say nay.
Nay.
Nay. Okay. Commissioner Kelly, your motion is to,
Include both develop and implement a climate action plan, address the potential future impacts of climate change on Deschutes County through incentives and or regulations.
second?
I'll second.
Okay. All in favor say yay.
Yay.
Aye. All opposed say nay. Abstain? Okay, so 4 yays and 1 abstention on that motion to include both the striked out language and the rest of the language. Number 8, should the county update wildlife inventories regularly and expand protection for wildlife species? Part 2, should state and federal recommendations be explicitly incorporated into these inventories or protections? While people are reading, I'll just note that it's possible a thought I had is you might be a person who would answer yes to at least number 1, but not feel the language needs to be changed. So, I mean,
Yeah,
think
that's my thought. Thanks for, yeah, that's, I see why this was suggested in some of the comments we received, and I would hope that any future, did I interrupt you?
not at all. No.
That any future reconsideration of an update to the inventories would in fact at least consider state and federal agency recommendations, and that they would be a part of the process. But I'm kind of agnostic on whether to actually call that out.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I think I'd concur. I think the existing language is more appropriate than putting it over, because this would more nearly exclude the others, where they certainly have the ability to participate in the process should they choose. I wouldn't move the emphasis to them.
That's a good way of putting it. Okay. Okay, looks like that one's a full agreement. So we probably don't need a super formal process for that. Okay. Number 9, should the county amend policy language to better balance protection of property rights and protection of wildlife resources through use of incentives instead of regulations?
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Cyrus.
I would move adoption of the proposed language.
Okay, is there a second? I mean, it's, if I'm understanding this one correctly, it seems like it's sort of like either you want incentives and not regulations, or you want incentives and regulations.
Madam Chair.
Yeah, cool.
So the current language as drafted, was a very, I would say a hot topic of discussion among the PC. We spent some time drafting it. So the current language tried its best to again seek that middle ground between regulations and incentives and also education. Whereas in this case, if you were to adopt the language in option A, it would remove the regulatory component. So it'd be kind of strictly focusing on promoting stewardship of wildlife habitat through incentives or education. So that's kind of the key difference there. So there's just a couple verbiage changing, removal of development regulations in policy 5.71 and removing require for the policy relating to clustering of development in 574.
Okay,
I'd be happy to address that if you want, but I'd probably need a second in order to do that.
well, in our new process.
Okay, well, okay,
necessarily.
then I'll explain my logic behind it. Because it's been my observation that education and incentives generally do more for protecting and doing for the wildlife than regulatory and punitive implications, in which case you may actually have the opposite effect, where the wildlife habitat is destroyed and where the wildlife is eliminated in order for people to avoid the regulatory impacts on their property. I mean, I think I've mentioned previously, case in point with the bald eagle nest that had thrived for years and raised lots of young up until the point when the regulatory portions kicked in and the landowner was told that they couldn't do anything on their property during certain months of the year. And that nest immediately came down. I mean, nobody's going to catch whoever did it, but the bottom line is that nest failed because suddenly the landowner went from protecting that nest to making sure that nest didn't impact his property. And so that's why I think an incentive program is far better than a regulatory program, whether it be deer or eagles or whatever. I mean, if I've got a whole lot of deer on my property and suddenly now I'm restricted from doing activities on my ground, I'm going to take advantage of the laws that allow me to do damage control, and I'll eliminate the deer on my property rather than have the regulatory impacts on my property. And so I personally think an incentive-based program is far more beneficial to the wildlife.
So I think Commissioner Cyrus's comment is really striking, and I am convinced that incentives are probably a better way to go. But I also don't really think it would be a great idea to have a comprehensive plan that basically says we can't regulate anything at all. I would rather see it play out with each individual situation or amendment to the county code and evaluate each one on a case-by-case basis instead of saying like absolutely under no conditions are we going to regulate this. But I actually agree with Commissioner Cyrus that incentives are really a good idea whenever possible, because I think he's right that rewarding people works a whole lot better. Other comments?
Yeah, I agree with your comment. I like the existing language, and I think when you look at implementation, there's nothing here that precludes incentives or encouragement and so forth. It just says that requirement may also be a tool depending upon what aspect of wildlife protections we're looking at. And a simple example would be leash laws in the city of Bend. The individuals that enforce the leash laws use education and incentive as much as they can, but there's a there's a large number of individuals out there that are perfectly aware of laws and regulations about leashes, and they choose to be scofflaws. And so there's also requirements, and it's always sort of an adjustment, a dynamic balance between having the regulations in place, but leading with education and encouragement, complimenting those individuals, for instance, that have their dogs on a leash. Anyway, I'm in favor of the existing language for, I think, the reasons you articulated, Chair Curris, rather than the suggested modifications.
Madam Chair,
Commissioner Cyrus?
I would like to point out the fact that this is specifically having to do with wildlife habitat and certainly has nothing to do with leash laws or traffic speeds or any of those type of regulatory things. But I also would like to bring your attention to the fact that under the current language, which provides for incentives, there are 0 incentives on the books now with regard to any of these things. All 100% of it is regulatory. And so even though incentives are listed right here in the current plan, they were not being used at all. And so I'd like to try something different.
Can I ask staff for a comment on that? Is that because of funding issues and things like that? Why there's not incentives playing a role in this right now? Why are we not following that? Or I guess we are following it because it's.
I think that's a great question. I might tap in Peter Gutowski, our Community Development Director, on that one, if you don't mind, Peter.
Yeah, I mean, I thank you, Madam Acting Chair Curris and members of the Planning Commission, Peter Gutowski, Community Development Director. I mean, Commissioner Cyrus is correct that you have a comprehensive plan that is the guiding document for, zoning ordinances and zoning ordinances regulations. When I think of incentives, it's not directly related, but there's farm tax deferral. That's not for wildlife habitat, but it's to incentivize farming and to reduce and minimize the burden of what it means to be, to be a commercial farmer. And so, there are those types of statutory responsibilities that find their way into comprehensive plans, into zoning codes. At one point in time, there was an Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife incentive program that allowed for, if one did, restoration on a property, they could get some tax deferral. That turned out that it was very difficult to monitor that program. So, it's a really good question. Why don't you see more incentives? The program offers, well, in the zoning code, for example, I'm going to give you a lengthier response probably than you were anticipating. But for example, if one is doing restoration that's sponsored by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife in waters of the state, they don't need a conditional use permit under our code. They still have to go through a kind of a land use compatibility where we check that off. So we do have examples of it that's built in our zoning code. That I think some of it is funding related, and the other is just the realities that the comprehensive plan is this policy driven document that guides zoning and development standards among other coordination efforts. That's how I would characterize it.
Thanks, Peter. And I think the only thing that I would add is keeping in mind that we will have, essentially an action plan for implementation of the comprehensive plan. So if commissioners felt like an existing policy that's carried over, if, it hasn't received enough attention or there's some additional work that are more action item related to implement that policy, we will be welcoming those suggestions too. So just wanted to keep that in mind.
That's what I was going to ask is, not wanting to get ahead of people who haven't made up their minds yet. If there was, like, let's say most of the commission thought that we really want to indicate somehow that we really think that we should be doing a lot more incentives, but maybe there's, people end up feeling like they want regulations as a possibility, but really want the incentives. It sounds like maybe you're saying that. I was going to ask you guys, like, is there a way we can do that in this process with the comprehensive plan, or should we not do that now and wait for the action plan?
Yeah, I think, Madam Chair, I think one item that you could do is, I think this came up in our last deliberations, last meeting, of whether or not to just elevate some things to the board and add some additional context to it. So if the commission wanted to say, we like the language as is written, but we would really like to promote the creation of incentive programs, we could carry forward that, even if it weren't in a policy, carry forward just that suggestion and discussion to the board.
It just occurred to me, sorry, just if I can, Madam Chair, another example, I don't know, would you call it an incentive? Would you call it a bonus? But when one does cluster development, we've seen a lot of cluster development over the years. Miller Tree Farm, the Westgate, that's how I call it, the West Side Transect Zone, which Westgate was the first project of the two, but that allowed for clustering development. So you get a bit of a density bonus. You get 2-acre minimums, and then there was you had to designate 65% open space. That open space had to be managed in a way that is responsive to the vulnerabilities to wildfire, but also managing it in perpetuity for wildlife. And there's wildlife corridors and whatnot. So I think that's is that an incentive, or is that just a very kind of flexible option for someone that wants to subdivide that property? I'll let that be open for debate. But I think the spirit of this existing policy, or the policy that's currently noted in under starting at 5.7.1, I think is maybe speaks to that circumstance.
Commissioner Altman, had you?
Chair. I was just considering another way to talk about incentives. If I look at the original 5.7.1 and also perhaps recommended language, if you just change some words around to say maximize incentives and education in order to promote stewardship of wildlife habitats through incentives, so that we really put the emphasis on that's our first line of how we want to approach this, is to maximize incentives and education. But failing that, I do think that there's a place for regulations. And I look at this more in terms of like cluster developments versus individual farmers doing something with their land. I'm looking at all possible scenarios of who might, fall under this item number. So I don't know if that would help to change the words around a little bit.
Commissioner Cyrus?
Yeah, and actually that was kind of my thought along those lines. And we might reword, and I don't have the exact wording, but I'm sure Nicole can wordsmith it better than I can. If you had something along the lines of promote stewardship and wildlife habitats by prioritizing incentives and public education with regulations as a last resort or something like that. So yeah, if the others aren't working, certainly appropriate place to put regulations in, but let's try the other first. And I agree with Peter with regard to clustering, which is the 5.7.4, incentivize and encourage benefits to a developer in order to take actions to do what's right, instead of putting regulations on it. Though that is a perfect example, in my opinion, of an incentivizing. It's a non-economic incentive that doesn't cost the county anything, but yet it accomplishes what you're looking for. I mean, they don't have to necessarily be tax deferrals or other things. There's other things. Maybe you get a bonus on a regulation somewhere for stepping up and doing XYZ.
Other thoughts?
Just a last thought, a counterpoint maybe. Not opposed at all to calling out incentivizing wildlife protections. The most powerful protections that we in this country have implemented for wildlife and habitat have been the Endangered Species Act. For habitat or natural resources, it's been Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act. Models of regulatory frameworks that have been massively effective by any measure. And that doesn't preclude incentive programs, but they have been wonderfully effective. And without them, we'd be in a whole different place. And I think that carries down to scale to the county plan. And again, I like the existing language that includes incentivizing protections, but if there were a way to call it out somehow and recommend that this commission, wants to call particular attention to incenting protections, that I'm not opposed to that either.
I think it's a good discussion, and I'm one. I don't want to necessarily take tools out of our toolbox. So I am in agreement. I would like to, maintain the current language, but I do love that adding in emphasizing the whatever language that is. And I was thinking to myself, like, okay, about regulation and wildlife, and like I like to walk my dog, and I wish I could walk him at Riley Ranch Reserve. But I also understand that why I shouldn't walk my dog at Riley Ranch Reserve, and that it's regulated because we saw cougar evidence out there. And I thought, oh yeah, this is what I shouldn't be frustrated with this regulation, because it makes sense. So sometimes I think regulations do make sense, even though I'm frustrated with them sometimes. So I am in agreement with kind of our collaborative and approach here.
So is anyone against the idea of emphasizing incentives to the board? Is anyone like not? Okay. All right. So that is a clear consensus that let me just ask this for the sake of making sure I got all my bases covered. Does anyone want to now second Matt's or Commissioner Cyrus's motion that we adopt the basically, I'm just trying to make sure that.
So basically what you're looking for is support for the concept that Nicole is going to fix for us, that we're incentivizing and, emphasizing incentives and education over regulation. Is that the summary that?
But keeping regulation.
Yeah, it seems like
I'm not
yeah.
proposing to eliminate the word regulation.
Okay, okay, great.
Incentivize the other first, because currently the way they're all equal, we have nothing in the first two categories.
Yep. Okay, so it sounds like you're no longer opposed to having the word regulation in there, but you would really like to see our board and our staff work together to create language that talks about prioritizing incentives and education.
Correct.
Okay, great. Do you feel clear on that? Okay.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Moving right along, we'll go to number 10, which is should additional detail on the 2021 to 2023 wildlife inventory update project be added to the chapter narrative?
Nicole, can I ask you to explain this a little more, please?
Yes, certainly. So this is a little bit different because it's about narrative rather than policy, but we got more than a few comments on it. So I just wanted to flag it for the commission. So essentially in our current draft of the comprehensive plan, we provide a really high level overview of the county's wildlife protections, and it highlights a couple different species that we protect, but it mostly differs to this appendix that we have that includes all of our ECs and programs to protect. And then of course, those are implemented through our zoning code. So we had some requests from public commenters to include a narrative about the 2021 to 2023 process in which the mule deer inventory was revisited, and ultimately the board's decision to essentially, end the project, not incorporate some, new updated inventory information. And then we also received public comments about adding to the list of causes of mule deer decline. So right now, again, there's a very basic summary about causes of mule deer decline. So this was a request to add, additional factors, including but not limited to things like predation trails and potentially homeless populations. And those were items that came up during that 2021 to 2023 process. So that's why it's kind of tied together. So it's at the discretion of the commission. We don't have a specific policy because it's, again, more about what information you want to include in the context for the chapter. So if you wanted to include information, you could just give us general direction and we could add to it. Or if you felt, hey, I'm fine with just a high level summary as it is today, you're welcome to do that as well. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
This one I had some mixed feelings about. So I wrote a big question mark on my matrix notes sheet. So that's
For your question.
well, that's why I want to see what everyone else thinks. I mean, I like the high level overview that goes with this chapter, and I feel like it's consistent with the other chapters, so that's great. That being said, we spent such a long time and had so much public involvement on that project that I get that information is available in the appendices, so that's great. So part of me is like, that's great, it's available if anyone wants it, and this keeps it nice and clean and consistent with the other chapters. But then I also was kind of like, well, I don't know, we did all this work, like, would it hurt to have just a few sort of sentences or something in there, like, and then I thought, well, okay, but it wasn't adopted, so then is it really fair to put a few sentences in there when it wasn't actually? Then you would have to say, but it wasn't adopted, and then it would just get kind of confusing. So those are all that's my stream of consciousness set of thoughts about the item.
And just to make it utmost clear, I think all the commissioners are tracking, but just want to note that otherwise in the comprehensive plan, there is no, reference to that 2021 to 23 process because exactly nothing was adopted. So if, it depends on, I guess, how important it is to include, a brief snippet of highlighting that. We've done that in other sections of the comprehensive plan. But usually I think in this version that we've created, we try to keep it as streamlined as possible, just because we want to keep it, for those who I hope will read it someday, more of a coffee table style book and not necessarily an all encompassing encyclopedia of all the work that we've done that's been adopted or not adopted over the years.
Sure.
Mm.
I agree with your thought process, almost to the word. I stepped through that too. I mean, I recall we went through an extensive process here. We listened to a lot of testimony, and we had extensive deliberations amongst ourselves. And ultimately, I think it went forward with a split vote in support of the recommendation that we update the inventory. And, the governing body decided not to, and that's their purview. So I went back and forth on this, some kind of brief statement to acknowledge all the work, especially staff put in to that. I wouldn't be opposed to that, but it seems a little bit odd to have it in there when ultimately the governing board decided not to go that direction. And a few years from now, a lot of that time and effort that went into that will largely be forgotten, unfortunately, but that'll be the nature of it. And if a future commission chooses to direct a reconsideration of that update, that would be their purview. So I land right about where you land, I think, on that.
Other thoughts?
Comment. I just want to echo what the both of you said about being torn on it. I think that the public was so engaged in that process that it would be a shame to not recognize to a degree their involvement in that. I don't know that it would need to go so far as to, point fingers like the planning commission said this and the commissioner did that and boohoo and, whatever. But just to recognize that a lengthy process was undertaken and the public was really involved because they really care and value this goal. And I had something else to say. Oh, I see this as, there have been times actually before I was on the planning commission that I did go through the comp plan. And I think it also serves as a resource for people to understand the priorities of what planning goals are, statewide planning goals are, how they relate to the county, and also how important they are to the citizens of the county. So, you know, I'm not going to wordsmith or like tell you what you should say, but I do think it is worth a small blurb. You know, during this time period, the county underwent a Goal 5 process. Here's what it's like. Here's a link to the, you know, public record if you want to go do that. Like spend some time looking through that.
I'll throw out an additional piggyback suggestion that you made me think of just now. If staff or the board didn't want to go into the specifics of the plan for any reason, or into that process, it might be nice to include a sentence or two about just, you know, county or citizen involvement runs really high on wildlife in this county, just kind of like a general, again, you guys are way better with the language than I am, but maybe just a general comment about how in the past public involvement and engagement in wildlife related amendments has been high, or some of the highest in our processes, because that's not just been true for the wildlife, for the mule deer update. It you know, it's been true every time we have a wildlife related amendment, we get tons of involvement, and that is kind of indicative of, we got great involvement in all kinds of things with this plan, but it might be nice to sort of highlight how much citizens here care about their wildlife, even though there's many different views on how to take care of our wildlife. But kind of like a public engagement comment about wildlife in specific. Anyways,
Can I ask staff a question?
yeah, please.
That the really nice, I forget if you call it a storyline or storybook or whatever it's called, that neat web presence. Does that still live?
I think it does. I think the mule deer inventory webpage is still active with that. It's called a story map, Commissioner.
Story map, that's the
Yeah.
word.
I'm not sure I'm not sure if it's been disengaged or not, or if it may be Will. I'm looking at Will.
It's still live. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah, so it's still under our prominent projects and resources.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't made the decision to take it off yet. You know, we want to, I don't think we've spent a lot of time thinking about this
Yeah.
link, but
I was just
anyway,
curious.
to your point.
I don't know where I was going with that. Other than that, it was really interesting and it had a lot of good material in there. It was fairly, I mean, I thought it was fairly neutral. We just sort of talked about the condition of mule deer herds. But you know, listening to my colleagues, I'm in agreement with Commissioner Altman and Karis that I don't know, somehow not mentioning that there's intense public interest in this and there was a process, but being careful with the language that there wasn't, you know, that ultimately the county decided or the commission decided, however you want to word it. I don't want to point at people either. You're right, Susan, but that ultimately the decision was made not to go forward with an update at this time. But maybe some kind of statement and leave it to staff to word it that there is intense interest, there was, and there remains. I'm in favor of that. I think that's a good idea.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Cyrus?
Yeah, I guess, you know, before I could determine whether or not I support different language, I need to know what the specific language is. But I certainly don't see a reason why there couldn't be something along the lines of that there was, you know, an extensive process in reviewing and updating the mapping and such, and that ultimately the Board of Commissioners chose to discontinue the process. I mean, it's just something very innocuous that recognizes that there was a pretty lengthy process that happened, and that, I mean, unless you're going to go into all the different details and testimony and reasons why up and down, and then you're looking at, you know, 50 pages of documentation behind it. But I mean, a couple sentences just to say that it, you know, there was an update process that was addressed and ultimately discontinued.
Yeah, Commissioners, if I may, and I think I think that's, you know, in line with, I think what we as staff were envisioning. And the only thing that we might add based on feedback was just there was extensive, you know, community input on this topic.
Yeah. I mean, without having to get into start getting into the weeds on, you know, what the different arguments were, et cetera, just that it was addressed and, you know, moved on.
Okay, so is anyone against us indicating to the board that we like the idea of adding some language about extensive community involvement on this issue? Does
No,
anyone
just-
hate that language?
I like that. I like public record as well. There's official, but yeah, no, I'm not opposed to that. It's a good idea.
Okay, great. So moving on, let's see here. We're on number 11. Should a limitation be placed on housing and development in high wildfire risk areas?
For me, staff has a pretty good recommendation here in their second paragraph. I'm inclined to defer to that.
That was my thought. Other thoughts?
I assume we're talking about number 11 on wildfire.
Correct, yeah.
I would oppose adding that additional language as a firefighter. I don't think the county's the place to be putting additional regulations on stuff, especially without knowing what's coming out from the state. Until the state recommendations are put out, I certainly wouldn't put something in here that we're going to take whatever they put out and then add to it.
Okay, other thoughts? Sorry, not rushing you. Yeah, take your time. We're moving right along, so I don't think we're in a rush.
I'm fine with this new language because I feel like it's broad enough. Consider favorite words. Local I don't feel like it's so I'm not worried because I don't feel like it's so specific. That does not make me nervous. The broad language makes me feel like there's some kind of wiggle room in how this could be implemented.
Okay. So far we've got a few people saying that they think the current language is fine, and then we have at least one person saying that is it that you're fine with the new language, or is it you prefer the new language? Like you actually would like to see
I
the
like
new-
to see that, and honestly, I keep thinking about like, maybe it's just because it's tax season and I'm like reviewing my insurance
Mhm.
and such. I think insurance is going to dictate I think that it's more complex than just. I think wildfire risk areas are increasingly a very important topic. Oh, Will's up.
Hi, Will.
Commissioners, your planning manager, Will Groves. I just wanted to give a little context in this since it's come out of the legislature. It appears that there's going to be a floor for wildfire safety that's going to be given in some of those bills. And some of them provide an opportunity that says if a local jurisdiction wants to do something beyond this, they may be given the option to. So what this policy would do if enacted, if the new option A was enacted, would be it would be considering adopting those additional regulations. So, I think that there would be certainly we're going to be obliged to take on certain statutory obligations with regard to wildfire. The question is, would we spend any effort, in the event that, we were given some discretion to do something more than that? Should we put any effort towards that, given that it requires local expertise, resources, could be politically divisive, maybe maybe expensive to homeowners. But this is, this policy as stated would be to just, put that in consideration as opposed to discard it outright. I don't know that it weighs a lot on the minds of decision makers in the future. It's not obligatory. I think it would just mean in those processes to adhere to this, it'd say, yes, we thought about doing the further and more advanced or more expansive fire regulations, and we chose to do them or not to do them for reasons. So that's really what this is getting at is, where options are presented in statutory structures. you know, should those options be explored, or should we, you know, really stick to the floor to minimize the economic, the direct economic impacts of fire compliance to our citizens?
So are you saying that if we stick with the current language, that means that once the state comes out with their statutory policies, like you have to do this, that means we would only do the bare minimum? Like we wouldn't have the option?
But without this being adopted, all things are on the table. This would be the planning commission and then potentially the board in the future recommending to itself as it considers future matters to take those, you know, to take seriously the possibility of doing more than the floor.
That's the current language or the new language?
That would be the new language.
So the current language means,
Any recommendations. So
okay, so we could,
you could still do it either way. This is just kind of a nudge to this. If adopted this would be a nudge to the board in the future from themselves to consider, you know, additional regulation where the statute allows it.
I guess that was my first thought reading it, and then I thought I had it wrong, but now I think I'm back on board again. It just seems like it doesn't add, the new language doesn't really add that much, but I really appreciate the clarification. It does add a little bit of a nudge, like a note to self. If we have the opportunity to add more, we probably should consider that. Okay.
Madam Chair.
Commissioner Cyrus?
Yeah, I would still, like you say, oppose this because we haven't seen the state regulations. The state regulations may come out to be so onerous, it's almost impossible to build. Insurance companies are going to come up with their own set. And if we start piling on, we may get to the point where nobody can build and or have anything that's affordable in these areas. So I'd rather stay silent on it. Let's see where the others all fall out and then address it as necessary when the time comes.
Commissioner Altman, do you have any thoughts?
I think I agree with Commissioner Cyrus on that.
Yeah, I've, you know, I'm wishy-washy, I guess, but I'm convinced, somewhat, differently than what I initially shot off my mouth about. But I think, Commissioner Kelly brings up a good point. The wording's pretty reasonable, reassurance from staff that this amounts to kind of a placeholder, for, the exercise of discretion, if some discretion is made available once the state kind of settles on a map and on risk categories. So I find myself backtracking a little bit. I think you made a good point. It's not that it's not that offensive a language.
Quick process question. We could say, by the way, I'm going to say no on changing the language on this one for me. So we could say there were 3 people that said, let's keep it the way it is, no change, and 2 people who were undecided. Or if you guys wanted to formally decide, you want to lean on that in that direction?
Leaning towards.
Because it's okay if you want to.
No, I'm fine with lean. It's pretty it's pretty soft that that's not a.
Okay. So you want to go, you're going to join the 4? I mean, you really don't have to, no pressure. Okay.
I think it's soft language.
And Commissioner Hopekamp, do you want to say undecided or do you want to say, let's keep it the way it is? Or agnostic, undecided. Okay. So we got 4 saying keep it the way it was, 1 undecided. I kind of like that there's an undecided.
Oh, you want us to.
Well, no, just, sorry, no, but just for the sake of the board, sort of understanding our discussion in a nutshell, I think it's good for them to hear that it's like, not everyone was like, oh God, no, don't change that. It was like,
Sure.
there were a couple people who were like, not so sure. So yeah, we want them to know what we think. So, okay. Number 12, should an additional policy be added to require more than one access/egress route to a development or subdivision in hazard-prone areas? So for this one, do you guys want to say?
So there's a current provision in the subdivision ordinance that says wherever possible, when you build a subdivision or partition, that there's 2 ways in and out. The idea is if one of them is on fire, the other one might be a way out of your subdivision. And right now it says wherever possible. And, you know, there'd been some concern that this does allow the creation of subdivisions where there's only new subdivisions where there's only one way in and out, you know, if there were topographical limitations, for example. You know, but our recommendation we don't need to engage with this because we'll be revisiting that code. We were talked about the clear and objective update, and wherever possible is, I think falls pretty far outside the objective. And so that's a piece of code that's going to move anyhow. And so we're recommending it's not appropriate to work on a policy at this time because the underlying language that was the purpose of, that was the comment and the source of the topic is actually moved regardless.
And commissioners, we included this in the matrix, I think, because it was included in one of the commissioners' kind of desired topics to discuss. So we just wanted to put it in the matrix since it's not precluded by state law and it's not an action item, but just also note that you don't really have to take any action on this.
Okay, anyone want to take action on it anyway?
Yeah, Madam Chair, I would just point out that I think maybe the solution down the road, although I certainly support having two accesses, there may be properties that physically don't meet those criteria or can't, but I could see some alternatives to something like that by saying additional fire hardening would be appropriate in the event that you can't have an emergency egress, to the point where you would have a development that is designed to be a shelter in place, one that would never need to be evacuated. So I can see some alternatives built into it, so where that wouldn't necessarily need to be a hard and fast rule.
I think that's and we'll be back to you with the clear and objective standards, without presupposing the outcome of that process. It looks like we would trend towards that there would be a clear and objective standard that thou shalt have two accesses, if you want to go clear and objective, and then the statute allows an alternative subjective process. So if you said, I don't want to, or I can't do two, you would go into a second lane, and that would be, well, you could have one, but if you're gonna have one, you got to figure out how people are going to be safe, just exactly Commissioner Cyrus's point.
Cool. So does anyone feel like we need to update the language here in number 12?
No, I respect staff.
Okay. Cool. Then we'll move to 13. Should an additional policy be added to address availability of affordable fire insurance?
No.
Anyone want to change number 13? I've gotten a shaky head, two shaky heads, and a no. Commissioner Altman, do you have strong feelings about this one either way?
I don't think insurance is the county's job.
Okay. So we're in agreement. We'll leave number 13 alone and go to 14. Should the county integrate Central Oregon Land Watch's recommended edits relating to the narrative summary of wildfire? Commissioner Cyrus, you look like you might have a comment
I would
ready.
just say that I don't agree with this statement, as 30 years in the wildfire business.
Would you be willing to say a little more why, just for the sake of our understanding?
Well, the language that's being proposed to be struck is more in line with my personal observations as having, like I say, 30 years plus experience fighting wildfires. And it has to do with strategies, tactics. It has to do with the fact that because they're no longer harvesting timber, a lot of the lands are overgrown. Also goes into tactics, because instead of preserving a resource, the timber ground is no longer considered resource land. And so they're more inclined to burn off tens of thousands of additional acres, because, well, it also goes to budgeting. When you've got a wildfire budget, you've got a huge purse you can draw from. And so all of the managed prescribed burns that they may have on the books for the next 10 years, if they're anywhere in the neighborhood, suddenly become part of the wildfire. So I've seen fires that could have been put out at a few acres go to 50,000 acres simply because it was convenient and there's no safety risk involved. If you just go back 5 miles and prep an area and just burn it all back off. The state, on the other hand, where they're dealing with private lands, they go direct. They put the fires out fairly quickly. Very much less loss of resources. And the managed timber typically burns much cooler, much less loss of resources. It has more to do with the forest management and firefighting tactics. And I haven't seen any evidence whatsoever of climate impacts on wildfires.
Okay. Nicole, I see you reaching for your microphone. Would you like to add some context and insight?
Sure. Yeah, commissioners, if I may, so the language that's currently being discussed, the one that's kind of the subject of those changes, I wanted to note, and this is in my staff notes, but this is just essentially the cover page to the chapter, like a very brief summary of it. There's a much more a much more broad discussion of wildfire further on in the chapter. So I just wanted to note that, in that we do acknowledge, some climatic changes. But I think that, again, for the purpose of the commission, we as staff recommends retaining the language as currently drafted, which is in the second box. That was drafted by Tamarack Consulting, LLC. It was one of our web consultants, and they're a wildfire consultant. So we consider them in this process, as far as drafting this language, kind of our subject matter expert. So we would recommend retaining their drafted language.
Well, that's interesting. That I'm glad to hear that. I thank you for referencing that those experts. Not that I doubted an expert consulted this, but constructed this. But I don't necessarily disagree with their recommendation. I don't like the striked language. I think that should stay in. I don't necessarily disagree with what they're saying. I don't like root cause, I think is a little aggressive, but I don't disagree with it. But now that I've heard that, hey, this is, later on in the chapter, it kind of goes in more detail, and that this was, originally created by, experts. I'm content leaving it as is, even though I do believe in climate change.
Okay. Yeah, so this is not, I don't think that we should I don't think if you like the language that's the way it is, it doesn't mean that you don't believe in climate change. And I don't really think that I'm just going to say I like the language the way that it is in the current draft plan for the reasons that Nicole mentioned, and then also what's just written here in terms of the climate change part being discussed in the chapter narrative. I also think there's a risk of, when we start adding different causes in, like every policy could end up being 6 pages long just because of all of the details. And I thought that you guys did just an amazing job crafting the chapter narratives along with the policies, and the graphic layout of the whole thing is really easy. It is kind of like a coffee table book or a magazine or something. Like it, somehow you guys managed to include the right information in the right location, so it doesn't feel like you're reading like a textbook or an encyclopedia or something. And I just think that all of that could be kind of like, it could deteriorate if we start adding too many redundancies and details everywhere. Just to, yes. And also, let's not forget about climate change, and let's again not forget about climate change or whatever. It could be a different concept too that people are not wanting to forget about. So I like it the way it is. Okay.
Can I just add, please, that this is far from a sort of fall on my sword kind of issue for me. I kind of wanted to just bring it up and highlight the suggested language. So I appreciate that being included in the matrix. Staff's comments that this was language suggested by the consultant. I respect that, but notwithstanding that, I mean, in my view, the second sentence in there, and God knows I don't want to wordsmith at this hour, but it does show a kind of a slant in a highly contentious area of forest management thought and practice and so forth. So I thought maybe some kind of inclusion, I don't know how you would word it, maybe not as extensive as was suggested by Landwatch, but some kind of reference to the fact that forest structure and density might be due, as is included in the existing statement, because of a general lack of large scale treatments and so forth. But that also something to do with conditions clearly altered due to climate change. And, you know, I don't read every bit of it that comes out, but I am aware that there is a really large body of evidence for that now in support of climate change, altering forest structure and susceptibility to wildfire and interaction with things like beetle infestation and all that kind of stuff. So again, not fall on my sword, and I want to respect my colleagues' insights and comments. But in my view, the extended existing language clearly is slanted and doesn't include, not, again, that there is, I am reassured, as Commissioner Kieras mentioned, that in some of the sub narrative that there's reference to climate change and so forth. So, you know, I don't have really strong feelings here, other than, again, to indicate that I think the existing language is not quite balanced. Thank you.
Will?
Like they acknowledge. Seems like this is the heat up where you pick either one or two relatively strong ends of an axis about how this is approached. It's kind of strange to me that the language doesn't start with wildfire management, which Cyrus spoke to. You know, in my literature part of this, if I were going to write this section, I would say that the reasons why it's, you know, that we're seeing more fires, you know, us putting out a lot of little fires and stuff, burning systematically, that also that changes in changes in timber harvesting behaviors have changed fuel loading, and also that, you know, at least some trend toward more. It's like I think a balanced approach that has the record would hit all three of those points. And it seems like, at least to me, the most important point, which is the way that fires have been managed, the way that we fought them historically, is completely excluded from that. It seems like maybe if you wanted to direct staff to kind of hit all three of those points, about wildfire management practices, forest product management, and practices, as well as warmer and drier conditions. I think that would cover more broadly the information that was provided in the record. Just a thought for your consideration.
That's really.
I'm in agreement.
I got a couple head yes nods, another head nod. Commissioner Cyrus, what do you think of this idea of wording it that way?
I was gonna say I don't have a problem with that. I would like to, simply point out that a couple other, for example, if you go back 100 years plus, we had much larger wildfires then than we do now. They were allowed before we started doing fire, before we started putting fires out. I mean, you had fires that burned, half the size of states at one point. And, the Tillamook burn certainly wasn't climate related. And some of these mega fires that eclipse what the biggest ones we currently have. And the other one, back to fire management, anything that starts on wilderness areas are allowed to burn. I mean, you saw what happened to Detroit. That was a result of, that canyon, granted we had a wind event, but that fire had been burning for over a month. And so it does have a lot to do with how we're handling and managing fires. And so, whether some climate events are impacting that or not, quite frankly, I haven't seen that personally. What I've seen is a difference in forest conditions and the way they're managed. But I don't have a problem in covering all the bases with all the different causes, but I certainly would not remove the language that's proposed to be stricken.
And I think, Will, you're suggesting actually putting the fire management bullet point at the beginning, leading with that rather than having it at the end.
Yeah, again, we not.
Yeah.
If we bring this forward to the board, it's either A or B, there's A, B, and C. In the materials we saw, A, B, and C were all identified as potential.
I mean, a combination of causes and factors that have created, increased fire activity.
You also said warmer and drier conditions rather than the words climate change. Do you want us to weigh in on? I know we're staying away from wordsmithing, but I noticed that language is less of a polarizing term. Yeah. So do you want people?
I would concur.
I'd like not polarizing.
Okay.
And I think your language as far as warmer, drier conditions, back to my comment earlier about the fact that in the 70s we were worried about an ice age. Those are also things that can change over time, and maybe 5 years from now or 10 years from now, there's no longer the factor, but it was a factor at the time that this was written.
That's a good point, because climate change means different effects for different places around the globe. And right now we're seeing warmer and drier climates. So it's even more specific than just saying climate change too. Well, yeah. Okay. Do you need any more info from us or discussion or voting or?
I think we have adequate information to revise. So yeah, appreciate the discussion.
Okay, great. So that concludes our matrix. Are there other issues people wanted to bring forward to discuss regarding the plan that weren't on the matrix? Okay, well then seeing none, we'll move on to planning commission and staff comments.
Madam Chair, can I
Yep.
ask my staff a question, just putting them on the spot? I think this process has gone really, really well. Thank you for your facilitation, Vice Chair Kiris, and to staff, just kind of working through the nuances of a updated comprehensive plan. The question I have for staff, and it's not like I'm not excited for us to have a shorter meeting that gets us home at a reasonable time. But I'm wondering, and Nicole's staring at me, do you think it would be possible to combine, to give the planning commissions modules 3 and 4 for their next meeting? Or, and I don't know the answer, and you may feel like, you know what, I like this pace. I don't need a long meeting into 8:30 or 9, but I just want to be mindful that you're on a roll. That might be something to just talk about before we get into the next agenda item.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Peter. And before we get into that, I'm wondering, so the reason why we split up modules 3 and 4 is partially because of the review of those letters in module 4. So my question, which might help you decide on what, or help us decide whether or not to combine those, is what level of detail you would like to go into on those letters. So for instance, Central Oregon Land Watch, I think I counted about 75 different potential narrative or policy or goal edits. As we mentioned, we're trying to avoid kind of red lines. We've tried to, put things into buckets so that we can kind of address things more, holistically. So the question would be if you want to go through those letters line item by line item, or if you'd be comfortable, telling us as staff, hey, really, these are the priority points that I would like to discuss. And then we can put that into a matrix. And the same would be for that COID letter as well. And Will.
If I might add to that, I think, tonight this was great. One of the things we've been trying to do is figure out what level to zoom in for you, what level of information to provide that gives you the level of engagement that you want with the material. And I think, we got through it quite quickly tonight because a combination of us, having watched you deliberate a couple times, understanding generally what's important to you, and serving it up in the appropriate format to that. And, there's a little bit of skill and a little bit of luck in that. It would be nice, that we had a lot of material to get through if we had teed up more tonight. And so I think Nicole's question is an interesting one, and one that we'll have to get to, and one I think you probably won't be ready. You might not be ready to make a decision about tonight, but what we could do is that we could tee up more material for your next meeting with a notion that, if it gets to be whatever time you'd like to get out of here, 8:30, we pull the plug at that point, that, so we don't run out of material if you still have energy left.
Yeah. I agree.
That was what I was going to suggest. I'd love to have the option to keep rolling, but not the expectation to keep rolling if people's brains are getting tired or, it's getting later, whatever. But to Peter's point, yeah, like I'm feeling good. If we happen to have more in front of us, I'd probably vote to keep going just because we are in kind of a groove. The other comment I'll make just to the question of how detailed do we want to go now that we've had 2 meetings so far. I kind of understand the process even after the first meeting a bit better than I think I did before. And so personally, I've found myself content with a lot of the way that the plan is written right now. But then every once in a while something comes up that I'm like, oh yeah, that would be really nice to, like let's change that. So it doesn't seem like I predict that as we go forward, the process like be even smoother next time because we all kind of know a little bit more what we're doing. And so I think next time we kind of go through our matrix, there'll be some that there just isn't a comment on and others that there are. But yeah, maybe we need to think about now that we've been through a couple of these, we need to think about what are we asking to be in the matrix and maybe set a deadline for ourselves of when we need to communicate that with them so we don't kind of keep procrastinating.
Yeah, and I think just to add, so you can kind of get to the nature of my question. So if we were to continue on with the process that we've been utilizing in reviewing those land watch and COID letters, you would have potentially 75 items on a matrix. So that's what I'm trying to identify is, would you like staff to line item those and have policy options? Do you want to just go through the letters? Again, line item by line item, just as they're written and say yes or no to the proposed edits, or would you prefer to kind of select, a few of the areas that you care most about for us to include in this format? But yeah, thanks.
You guys have any thought? Oh, sorry, Will?
I think one other option would be for you to direct staff to, basically take our best guess about what would be interesting to you. We think those places where the commission would, most likely like to have discussions, take, a limited selection of those ones that represent policies or general directions, build a matrix, and then sort of leave the letters in their whole so that, you could, at the end of that, we could say, hey, we went through a matrix, of the 75 issues that were raised, we brought forward to you a dozen, that we thought would be salient and interesting to you and give the general direction, that you wanted to give to the board. Following that, is there any particular thing that we didn't get to that you really want to put your stamp on? So, you could give us some direction, what's important to you, yes, a combination thereof. So that's also available option.
Okay. Madam Chair.
Commissioner Cyrus?
Yeah, I would have a quick question. It sounds like you're talking about the couple letters that you're referring to, like you say, 75 different points. Of all the testimony that we heard, it seems to me that there's maybe an undue emphasis being placed on a couple letters that essentially are offering up a red line, more so than what we've seen weight added to any other set of comments, et cetera, from the public. And I guess my preference would be, regardless of who the letters came from, that they shouldn't have any more weight than any other participant from the general public. And I think maybe take the highlights as the particular issues that, I certainly don't intend to spend an entire night going over one letter that somebody submitted simply because they think they're more important than everyone else.
Nicole?
So just to provide some context of why those 2 letters were essentially, I guess, elevated. So the first Central Oregon Irrigation District, they had some terminology related edits that we were thinking of just incorporating, similar to what we did with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But there are also some narrative edits that had a particular perspective. So we wanted to get the Planning Commission to weigh in on those. So we included those in kind of the list of topics that the PC could choose to add to the matrix. And I believe several commissioners wanted to discuss those. Additionally, when we were talking about, again, just topics to include, I believe that there was at least one commissioner who said that they wanted to go through Landwatch's letter in detail. So that's why we, essentially elevated those. But if the commission, to Will's point, felt that there isn't the need to go into that level of depth on the land watch letter, I would say that's the more extensive of the two. Then to Will's point, we could bring forward just some of the topics that we anticipate may have been of interest to, you know, the commissioner or commissioners who wanted to discuss that. Or you could choose to you know, essentially say, hey, I feel like we're covering enough with some of the topics that are coming forward through, again, the general kind of buckets of public comment.
I think one thing I'll request from my fellow commissioners who did suggest the Central Oregon Land Watch letter, and please feel free to not honor the request, see it as a request. But if you could go through the letter and select the items that you feel strongly about, just that would make me feel a little bit better of like, hey, this is not Central Oregon Land Watch sitting on the commission and we're elevating their letter and everything they have to say, but rather we're elevating whatever Commissioner Hopecamp or whatever Commissioner Altman found important about those letters. And if you really did find every single item very important, I really would definitely encourage you to list all of them. And it's not my place to say what's important to other people on the commission. So I just really want to be very clear about that. But if there were, you know, 50 of the 75 items that were really important, then I'd be more interested to hear like, oh yeah, one of my fellow commissioners were really into these 50 items rather than these other 25. So that's just an idea.
Agree with that, and completely agree with that. Like the process as it's been going, really like the matrices and the format of the matrices is really useful with existing language, suggested language, some commentary from you and so forth. I think that's a good framework for moving forward. Agree with what Commissioner Karas just mentioned. I looked at, as I know we all did, at all of the testimony in the record, and I understand that certain parties, the irrigation district comes to mind, Land Watch come to mind, that have a lot at stake here and are deeply steeped in these issues. So I understand why they provided really substantive letters and so forth. And I looked at the Land Watch, two letters actually, one initially and then a subsequent one that followed up with specific language, and called out a half a dozen or so items in particular and cut and paste those into the letter that's, I think, part of the record that you all shared with my colleagues up here. And just keeping track of those half dozen or so, I think we've already addressed about 2/3 of them. So just a couple remain. So I feel that the issues that I wanted to elevate from the testimony and on the record, particularly the letter from Land Watch, have been addressed sufficiently. And I'm content with that level of detail going forward, but I'm not speaking for anybody else. I think it was my colleague, Commissioner Altman, that also highlighted that letter. So I'm not speaking for anybody else, just for myself. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll speak up on it. I apologize if I gave the impression I wanted to go through that line by line. Like no. But I mean, I will review it again and see if anything else jumps out at me. I did look at Commissioner Hofkamp's request that he made. That is not my ask, just to make everybody feel better about that. But yeah, I'll have a look at it. If there's anything that jumps out, I'll ping you on it, but that's not my intention. Thank you.
That is very helpful, commissioners. I think just helping us prepare for the next meeting. So we'll plan to bring forward enough material to cover modules 3 and 4, so the remainder of the document, and we'll try to get through as much as we can before 8:30 p.m. And if we carry over to the next meeting, we'll still be on schedule. So just appreciate all of your work and getting through this with so much great detail and care, and I feel like we're making really great progress.
Commissioner Cyrus?
Yeah, I concur. Is there a deadline on when you need those comments on what specific items you'd like to see elevated?
So our packet is due on Thursday, and I'm trying to get Will all of that material. He does go on vacation. You'll hear a little bit more about that soon. So I would say if you could by Monday morning, I think that would be most helpful so that I have adequate time to add those items into the matrix. We can all review it and get it uploaded in time.
Right, thank you.
Great question. Okay. Staff comments.
You go first.
Oh, sure. I'll start with the fun stuff. Well, I'll be out for, let's see, we've got the the upcoming meeting on the 22nd. And just double checking, and I will be back for your next meeting. So I'll be missing. I'll be on the other end of the world down in Patagonia. Apparently getting rained on and winded and blown over and hiking 60 miles.
Wow.
And going up the Chilean Lake District where it's 90 degrees and swimming in pools and lakes, and very excited. Wanted to do this since I was 20. We've been working with the Historic Landmarks Commission, and you can be on the Historic Landmarks list when you're 50, and I'm turning 50. So
Ah.
nominate myself for protection. So I've got that coming up. I just want to, again, as I said, I want to thank you. This is, we at the outset, we were really unsure how to help you engage with this material. And, we've been through an iterative process through talking to you, through you talking to us, and we've found a great pathway of engaging with this. And at the same time, we may need to retool, this is just as we go along, we'll see how it goes, and keep giving us feedback, and we'll keep trying to make your job as pleasant as possible as you work your way through this. In terms of other staff matters, I want to talk, I just want to remind you the clear and objective that, our consultant that we're expecting, MIG, who worked on our comprehensive plan, will also be working on the clear and objective update. And we're expecting them to join our team here and have their contracts signed and ready to go here in a couple of weeks. Staffs internally, we've been working on these issues, and there's going to be lots of interesting stuff for you in the future in that regard. Little preview, there's also some interest that we've received a couple applications for a interest in putting mini storage in the MUA 10 zone under certain circumstances. So we've got some, you probably saw in my weekly email to you, we've got some of those teed up in the future. Nicole heading those up as well, so you'll get to see more of Nicole. Also, just acknowledging that the 24th short session at the legislature is going on. And we're engaging with this through our Association of Planning Directors, as well as through Association of Oregon Counties, tracking bills and things like that. At least to date, some years, we see what's out on the legislative radar, and we realize that it's going to eat the entire next year of the Planning Commission with things like the RVs as rental dwellings and ADUs and things like that. And this year, there doesn't appear to be anything that's coming out of the legislature that's going to eat up all of our time right away. So, for better and worse, it seems like that's going all right. Anything anyone was hoping I was going to address this evening?
We want to see pictures of your trip.
That sounds like fun. There is one bill that, of course, it may or may not pass, having to do with ADUs and EFU that's currently working its way through.
Yeah, that one's an interesting one. We definitely have our eyes on it. It seems, without predetermining the outcome of that, of which I have no control over, it seems like there was an interest in a bill to allow people in rural lands to put in a second house for family members. And that one, I think, at least as kind of the initial discussion suggests, is that it may not be found to be ready for prime time this time, that there's, questions about wetlands and, it addresses fire safety in some of the way ADUs did, but, also there were some concerns about, how do you track that somebody living in a dwelling is a family member? What happens, if they don't have a family member? Does it sit empty? So it seems like an interesting concept. Certainly, we want to provide housing for people, and certainly we will allow people to care for their families. I think that's a broad goal in the state. But there were a lot of ifs, ands, and buts. It seemed like they weren't completely worked through, but it'll be interesting to see if it doesn't proceed this session. We anticipate there'll be continued interest in something like that in the future.
Cool. Nicole, do you have any comments?
Just thanks so much again. Really appreciate everyone's work tonight.
Okay. Peter?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. The Planning Commission recruitment for Patrick Trowbrid's vacancy, that recruitment ends tomorrow at 4. So I anticipate, probably a week from now, we'll probably get some input from the board. It may take a week or two, but Commissioner Keiris as vice chair, Commissioner Williams as chair. I anticipate it'll be a similar process as what's occurred in the past, where the three of us are matched up with a county commissioner for interviews. The interviews that short list of interviews will be based on board direction. So I'll have an update in 2 weeks. It's hard for me to think that interviews will happen immediately. It feels like it's going to happen in mid-March, and the timing is good. I think if my goal would be to try to have a planning commissioner on by our last meeting in March, which leads into my second topic. Just to let you know, I'm thinking about it, and you'll be thinking about it soon. Our work plan for next fiscal year. So, your first meeting in March will, which is the I want to say it's the 14th. That'll be a work session, and then the hearing will be on the 28th. So if I can have a new planning commissioner that can weigh in on the work plan, that would be an excellent outcome. So it puts the planning commission in a position to kind of deliberate and make your recommendations in your first meeting in April. Wanted to give you an update on the short-term rental conversations that will be happening with the Board of County Commissioners. That is scheduled for when Will's landing in Santiago, February 21st. Stephanie Marshall, who's here, Assistant Legal Counsel, and I have offered memos that are going to be carried forward by a management analyst, Jen Patterson. I will share with you that the Community Development Department, I want to be responsive to the board's interest in short-term rentals, whether they want to create a specific license for one, whether or not they feel like that's appropriate to first amend the zoning code to identify where those uses should be allowed as a permitted use. Ultimately, that's going to be a board decision. There's liability or the potential for legal liability. I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. And it's something that Stephanie and I have already communicated to the board. So this is nothing that has to be kept kind of behind closed doors, but the board's going to have to make some informed decisions about the level of risk that they want, if they want to go forward. All the counties that have active short-term rental programs, they've found themselves before LUBA. Opponents have challenged a short-term rental program as being violating state law, being a commercial use. There's case law that's come out of Clackamas County that have found that short-term rentals are not allowed on resource zone land. There's also some resource challenges that I'm having with the department right now. I want to be responsive to the board, but I'm going to be obligated to share with them that we have our primary duties, right, in addition to serving the planning commission, are to ensure that we're timely issuing and reviewing and issuing building permits and septic permits and land use permits. And we've had some resignations recently. Our operating hours are going to get reduced starting in March. So I've got bandwidth issues. And so to the extent that the board wants to take advantage of this opportunity, understands the importance of regulating this industry, there's a role for CDD. I'm obligated to tell the board that I need staffing and I need resources. Much of what Community Development Department does on a regular basis, and we're seeing this with rural accessory dwelling units now. We've only had a handful of site authorization permits for septic systems and building permits for a rural ADU, and I think those building permits, the few that we have, are correlated with the land use applications. But the level of resources that we have to put out there to respond to questions for pre-apps, I mean, Commissioner, so I look at Commissioner Kelly, I mean, and you're providing, like, we want our system and our priorities are to ensure to the best of our abilities that the public makes an informed decision. And those level of inquiries, whether they're pre-application meetings or emails or whatnot, that doesn't always immediately equate to revenue for a fee-dependent department. So I'm going to be having some conversations with the board along those lines, because it's not something we can just absorb. The next item I wanted to let you know, they've spoken to it, but Nicole is going to be taking advantage of processing two applicant initiated amendments. That as a result of that prioritization, we are we are postponing the scoping of the Newberry Country Plan. So I think I think that pause will something for all of you to think about. That pause may be worthwhile as we come into the work plan and you think about prioritizing the work that we need to be doing for next fiscal year. That'll be an opportunity to leverage that Newberry Country Plan and or leveraging it and acknowledging some of the other priorities that we have. But we've been in light of the applicant initiated amendments, we're pausing it right now. And another reason why we were pausing it is we wanted to have a better understanding of what outcome might happen yesterday. With the Board of County Commissioners and their meeting with the Department of Environmental Quality. Yesterday, for about an hour, the board was engaging certain members from DEQ regarding the letter that they wrote in December about groundwater vulnerability and the importance of protecting a sole source aquifer from nitrate loading. Ultimately, we didn't get much direction from the board and much kind of offering from DEQ about they both didn't kind of acknowledge what they were looking for from each other. Staff was engaged. I was engaged. Todd Cleveland, our on-site wastewater manager, was engaged. The board wasn't speaking with one voice, different opinions, different emphasis. So that's I think we're looking for. I anticipate there'll be another meeting with DEQ and over the course of the next several months. I'm hopeful that as those conversations occur, we can get a better understanding of what they're looking for from the community development department and from the organization at large, and vice versa, what the board's expectations are from DEQ. So if anything, I want to let you know that meeting happened. And there's a lot of history. I think, Will, you forwarded, I believe you have the summary of kind of what we've done over the last several decades in terms of our engagement on groundwater protection. Did you guys get that kind of spreadsheet? Or so anyway, more to come on that topic as we understand the expectations from a state agency as well as elected officials on this important topic of groundwater protection. So thank you. That was quite a list, that a lot to update you on. So I turn it back over to you.
Thanks. Stephanie, do you have any updates?
Good evening, everybody. Stephanie Marshall, Assistant Legal Counsel. Peter covered a lot of what we have going on. One quick comment I wanted to make: if you heard beeping, I'm a diabetic, and it's my insulin pump going off, and I am so sorry. I ran out to get some things to address it. So it could happen in the future, just kind of FYI. And if you have any questions about that, pull me aside and let me know. But yes, I'm trying not to be disruptive, so I was a little bit embarrassed. Other than that, I'll just echo what I've heard staff and Peter say. It's really refreshing and exciting to watch you all work through all of these big, heavy lifts. But I was very impressed tonight. So that's just my comment for this evening. I'm not going to Patagonia, although I was. So I will see you for the foreseeable future. So, but if there are any questions you have of me regarding any of the legalities, either ask me now or feel free again to reach out at any time. I've always loved this kind of work, and I'm really happy to be here at the county doing it.
Thank you so much for coming and it's really good having you here. And I actually completely didn't even notice the beeping. So
good.
Don't even,
I'm
no worries at all.
Yes, spotlight.
Right. It always feels like everyone must be just It went totally over my head. Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Mhm.
Commissioner Cyrus, comments?
Yeah, I spent way too many hours on tractors. I couldn't hear your beeping anyway.
Well, there you go.
and Will, enjoy, have fun, and Nicole, great job. I appreciate all the work you put into that. It certainly made our process, easy. I mean, maybe we skipped over 90% of what we should have looked at. I have no idea, but what we did looked great. So, and thanks, Peter.
Commissioner Altman?
I thought it was a really good meeting.
Yeah.
I think it was one of our best
I think
in
so.
terms of decision making and discussion and consensus or not. So thank you for running a really good meeting, and thank you, staff, as always, and have a wonderful, wonderful trip. Happy birthday.
Commissioner Kelly?
No, I agree that this process has been really enjoyable for me because I'm being a lot of topics I'm enlightened by my, fellow comrades here, and so
Mhm.
appreciate everyone's comments and support, and especially you guys. I mean, thank you, and yeah, we'll see you in a couple weeks.
Commissioner Hovgate?
Really like the progress on the comp plan, and I think the pace is great. I was struck by our meeting tonight as well. I'm trying to practice more of keeping an open mind, and I find myself just switching how I feel about things when I listen to you guys. So I like to approach things with an open mind, sometimes maybe a little bit less open, but your great points do make a big difference, and I find myself flip-flopping. So I hope that doesn't come off as indecisiveness, but rather just sort of thinking as I'm going along. But mainly, I just want to say, kudos to staff, Nicole, you in particular, for moving this right along. It's a huge project, and it's been going on for a couple of years at least. And there's very little room for anyone to say that this process has not been thorough, and that we have not very thoroughly combed through the public record and the comments that were made, and given great consideration to the public comment, and very thorough process, but still sort of nicely paced in making significant progress each time. So I think you've got it right in the sweet spot. I like the plan for our next meeting to maybe queue up a little bit bigger chunk with no commitment necessarily to get through all of it if we can't, but to have that ready if we can. So yeah, please queue up a bigger chunk. And then lastly, I'm not going to be here next time. So that's why I'm particularly in favor of queuing up a big chunk. Just a heads up. I apologize to my colleagues up here and staff, but I do believe attendance is important. I try to be here, but I will be missing our February 22nd meeting, our next meeting, and also it looks like this. I think the second meeting in March, which is the 28th there, which is kind of in the middle of spring break for us slackers in the education world. So I'm probably going to be missing that as well, and I apologize for that.
So
That's all I got.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll just keep an eye on the 28th, March 28th, because we have 2 commissioners so far who are not available. So I'm available. Of course, if anyone becomes unavailable, especially for the March 28th, please let the staff know, or Chair Williams, and we'll maybe check in with her and make sure she's going to be here then. But yeah, it's funny, Commissioner Hopkamp, that you're mentioning the open-minded thing, because I was actually just thinking that today of how much more well-rounded I feel my views and my knowledge are because of being in this group and listening to all kinds of different ideas and hashing them around, and not just repeating sort of like things that you're supposed to say about things. Rather like actually really very carefully considering the issues. And I know, of course we don't always agree, which is a good thing, but at least you guys really think, everyone here really thinks about stuff and really hones in on these nuances and complexities. So I really like how the plan captures all of that somehow. And I know there may be folks out there who are kind of, maybe look at what we come up with and feel dissatisfied to some degree, but because they wanted one more extreme or other extreme point. But I don't think living together in a community is ever about fully getting your way. I think whether it's a family or a small community or a larger community or entire country, I really think that, it means a good compromise or a good way to live together is everybody gets something that they want and gets enough of what they really need. Rolling Stones. Here we go. Anyways, I think you guys see what I'm saying, but I really think that it's like opportunities like these, and even with our public hearings where people are sitting in a room together, listening to what other people are thinking and saying, that allows people to kind of get together and feel like they're in a community with other people instead of feeling so isolated and angry and separate from one another. So I think we have something special with not just our group here, but our drawing people into that process. So I'm really thankful to be a part of it.
Well said.
I'm almost tearing up over
Oh.
here.
All right. Well, before any of us start crying, I will go ahead and 7:25.